On today's tutorial, we're going to talk all about how we add this scroll-driven flowing path. So as you can see, as we scroll up and down this website, we get this line that draws itself depending on the scroll position. And if we go back up the page, it will undo. Now, this was actually inspired by another website called Lusion, or Lusion, I think it's called. And this has a lot of different effects on this website, and it's a really great site. But we're going to pick this one effect you can see here as we scroll down the page. This line will start to draw itself up and around the page itself. And as we go back up, it will draw away. So on our site, we're going to take this and apply it to a dancing website because we felt like it's a nice flowing thing that kind of adds a really nice design effect to it. How do we go about making this from scratch? Well, we'll find out in today's video. So as usual, let's start off with something. What I've done is I've just made a quick site that looks like this. We can see there's no scroll path when we scroll up and down the site. It's just basically a bunch of images in a grid system right now. So let's have a look at what I've made. So in our HTML, fairly kind of straightforward. We've got a head, which is up here, dance house. We've got a section with some figures inside of it, and then a footer down here with two navs. I've also added a script tag just for later called scroll.js. Currently that is empty. We'll add things into there a little bit later. We've also got our style sheet, and this is fairly simple as well. We've got a kind of typography. We've just got a reset in here. We've got a fixed header. We've got a section with a grid, and then we're basically placing our figures within the grid itself to basically make it a bit more interesting. Then we've got another footer. Again, it's fixed. We've kind of split them into two. So one over here, one over here. And then that's pretty much it. What we want to do though is add this kind of scroll effect. Now in here you might also notice I've got this squiggle.svg. Now this has basically been made in Figma. So I've just gone into Figma. I've got an artboard which is 1x2 right now. Again, sizing depends on how long your page is. It could be 1x3 if your page is quite long. And then I've added my own vector using the pen tool. Now, one thing, if you are making your own curves, it can be quite tempting to add a lot of points in here, go like point, 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 point. But it's actually fairly easy if you just add lots of simple points and then just address these kind of things instead. So what we're kind of really working on is, minimum points in here as possible, and actually working with the actual anchors of the points to make it have this nice curve. And what you'll get is something like this. I've just literally exported this into my project in here, and this is what it looks like as an SVG. Now, the one thing we could do is just quickly just add this over the page and be done with it. So how would we do this? What I would do is in my index.html, I could go down towards the bottom, add in an image tag with the source of squiggle.svg. And then what I want to do is basically put that over the page. Now, I want to give this maybe a class of squiggle, just so I can reference it in my CSS. And if I look at the page right now, it will just be right at the bottom. There we can see it. But what I want to do is basically have this over everything. So I want to use this image with the class of squiggle and put it over everything. So in my style sheet, I can just go to the bottom and say image.squiggle. And then we can do something like position absolute. And then I'm going to put this in the top left corner, 0 and 0. I'm going to give it a width of 100 VW, which is just a viewport width, basically 100% of the width. And because this is 1x2, I'm going to give it a height of 200 VW as well. So we're using the width and going twice down, basically. So what we'll get now is this being over, well, kind of under the page right now. If I want this over, I'll just use some z-index. So z-index of something like 1, maybe. And this is now over the top. But again, this doesn't animate right now. So how do we go about making it do some animation? Well, what I could do is say, well, I can't really access the thing in the image right now. So notice on my index.html, let's just reference this squiggle.svg. What I want to do is basically use the thing within the squiggle.svg to pull this out. So let's change our image tag for actually just putting an SVG in here from scratch. So what I want to do is pull out the content of this, and rather than link to it, instead actually just use it directly in HTML. So let's just get rid of this image with the source of squiggle. And instead, I'm going to basically put in my SVG. What I can just quickly do is go into this squiggle.svg and copy and paste this. So I'm going to copy and paste this in here and press save. Now, there's a few things in here that we don't need. This is just things that Figma or Illustrator or whatever kind of image processor you're using here, they'll just give you a bunch of stuff that we don't really need here. So for instance, I don't really need this G, which is group. So I'm going to get rid of this G. And also I don't need this defs with clip path in here as well, because this is already clipped using my CSS. So I'm just going to get rid of this as well. And what we're going to do is save this. Now, what I want to do as well is have this over the page, just like we had with the image. So I'm going to give this SVG a class of squiggle. And then I'm just going to update my CSS to match. So in my CSS, I had this as image.squiggle, but now it's not an image tag, it's an SVG tag. So I'm going to save this. So this will do the same thing as before. It doesn't look any different. But why have we done this? What we want to do is basically, we can actually now go into the path and do things to it and change it on the fly. Something we wouldn't be able to do if it was just an image. So for instance, at the moment, this red color is the wrong red color. The red color is actually this. So I'm going to use this instead. So just to prove this works, I'm going to do svg.squiggle. And then let's get the the path inside of this. So remember, this is just a path. We can actually change the stroke color to anything else we want. Oh, actually is the correct one, but let's change it anyway. Let's change it to pink just for now. So I want to change the path's stroke color. So stroke is going to go to pink. Just to see if this works, we're going to save this, and what we'll see now is the path being in pink. Now, what I want is this path to be a little bit thinner, so I could actually just change it here as well. I could say change the stroke width to be something like maybe half a rem, for instance, because I'm using rems in the rest of my code. So this is a bit thinner now. So this gives us a little bit more control with our CSS, but also it will also give us some control with our JavaScript as well. So the goal that we're trying to do is essentially animate this thing in, but technically there isn't such a thing as animate this in. What we're trying to do is basically draw this pathway. Now, how do we go about doing this? So I'm going to show you a little trick. Now, let's look at this image in Figma. What we want to do is basically say, well, we want this to kind of animate in from this top end and basically fill this in. We're actually going to use a cheat. What we're going to do instead is use dashed lines. So here what I can say, instead of this being a stroke, I could change this to here, a dash. Now, what I want to do here is basically make this dash really long. So something like, rather than 60, something like 600. And what I want to do is just make this really long, like 6,000. And again, Figma doesn't really work well with kind of big numbers like this. But what I want to do is essentially take this and kind of start to make this longer and longer. But what I'm actually doing is making this a really long dash line, and essentially just shifting that dash along. So we're seeing from the kind of solid to the kind of non-solid version here. So this is kind of what we're trying to do. We're basically turning this into a dashed line and then shifting the start of that dashed line depending on how down we are in the scroll. So how do we go about this? Well, I need to jump over to my JavaScript. So in here, I've got my index.html, I've got a script with the source of scroll, I've got this scroll.js, which is currently empty. What I want to do is basically take the SVG and then take the path of the SVG and then change its kind of like where its dashes are, basically, as we scroll down the page. So first thing we're going to do is pick the SVG as a constant. This is going to be a const SVG. In our document, we'll do a query selector. What do we want to select? Well, we want to do the SVG with the class of squiggle. So now we've got the whole SVG. What we want to do is find the path within this. So I'm going to do a constant of path. This is going to be equal to, on our new SVG thing that we just made, I want to do a query selector on this and get the path. So I could do this all as one. I'm going to just separate them out to make it a little bit more clear what is going on here. But what do we want to do to the path? Well, when we do something like a scroll or any kind of movement with the scroll, basically what we want to do is update the path itself. So I need a function to do this. So I'm going to do a constant. Let's give this a function called scroll, and let's make this a function, round brackets, an arrow, and curly brackets. Now, I want to run scroll when I do what? Well, whenever I move the page. So I want to run this on when I load the page and then when I move the scroll of the page. So I'm going to run this scroll as soon as we load the script, and window.add event listener. I'm going to listen out for a scroll. And when I do a scroll, I want to run what? Well, I want to run this scroll function I've just made, scroll. Now, currently this scroll function is just empty. There's nothing in these curly brackets to actually do anything. But what do we want to do here? Well, what I want to do is basically say, well, let's make the path dash just for now. Let's just make it dashed. Let's see if this works. So on the path, I want to change its style. What do I want to change about its style? Well, I want to change its stroke dash array. Now watch out for the capitalization here. It's the just capital D in here. It's not a mistake. It's just the way that CSS and JavaScript likes to talk to each other. In here, what I want to do is say what the dash array is. So this is going to look similar to what we have in something like Figma. In here, I've got a dash and it's just a number. I'm going to do this in backticks and say this is just 60 for now. So we're going to save this. Has this done anything when we look at the page? Let's have a look. We do see these dashes. So we can see here, I've got this pink dashes on here that will be red eventually. But what we can see is this is a dashed line. It's kind of doing what we expect. Now I want this dashed line to be actually really long. I don't want it to just be 60 or even something like 600. We still see these dashed lines, but this is kind of not connecting now. What I want this to be is actually the length of the entire path. I want the dash to be exactly the same as the length of the pathway itself. So to do this, before we actually say 600, what I want to do is say, well, how long is this path? Is it 600? Is it 6,000? Is it 4,000? We don't know. So I'm going to save a new constant, and I'm going to call this to path length. What I want to do is make this equal to the path. And on the path, what I can do is a dot get total length. And again, watch the capitalization here. It's capital T, capital L. Now this will give me a number that's basically I can plug into this stroke dash array. So here what I'm going to do is replace 600 with $sign and then curly brackets, path length inside there. So this is just putting that number straight into this string. I'm going to save this now and let's see what we get. Now what we'll get is basically this path length looking like this. This is basically going all the way to the edge, and then off the edge, it kind of matches up. So it doesn't look like a dashed line. It's just filling this up. However, if we do something like times by 0.5, this is going to be half the length of the path. So this will just basically fill it up to halfway. So this is the halfway point of this entire path. So this is basically doing a calculation now. It's saying how long is this line, and then makes these dashes be, at the moment, halfway across this line. I want this to be the full version of the line because I want this to animate in eventually. So this line will be the line of the entire path, but I want to shift this line depending on where we are on the scroll position instead. But let's just see this in action first. How do we see this in action? Well, I've got the path dash array, but I also want the path dash offset. I want to shift this around now. So here what we're going to do underneath is change its style on the stroke dash offset. And this is going to be equal to, let's just put in 600 again. So we'll do this backtick, 600. And let's see how this looks. So what we'll get now is this starts in the right position, and this will stop 600 from the end. Is kind of what we're doing here. If this number is higher, something like 6,000, then this will give me a different kind of effect. If this is something like, 3,000, again, this will give me different effects because this is changing where these dashes are now. We're shifting the start of the dash along the pathway itself. What we want to do is control this using not just a random number like 3,000, but depending on where we are on the page in scroll. So the next thing I'm going to do is basically find out where I am down the page. I'm going to save this to a constant called distance, kind of like distance down the page. This is going to be equal to window dot scroll y with a capital Y. Now, distance is just going to give us a number in pixels. If we're at the top, it's going to be 0. If we're 300 down the page, it's going to be 300. I'm just going to put this number into here instead. So we're going to get rid of this and replace it with distance for now. So let's see what happens here. Does anything happen? So here, what I get now, if I refresh, is there's something happening if we go down towards the bottom of the page, but it seems like it's going backwards, which kind of makes sense in a way because we're actually shifting the offset the further we go down. So we're shifting this back as we go down the page. So it kind of makes sense, but it's not exactly what we want. We kind of want it to do the opposite. We kind of want it to go backwards. So what we need to do next is work out what's the entire distance we're trying to scroll here? Like how far should we be scrolling down the page? So we've got it in pixels of how far we're down, but next we want to do it as kind of like a percentage of the entire page itself. So the next thing I'm going to do is find out, well, how big is the page? What is the scrollable distance that we should be getting? So next I'm going to do the total distance. So we've got the distance for scrolling down, but we're going to do the total distance next. There's a few ways to do this. I could do like how tall is the entire of the page. That could be one way, so let's do that. Here, what I'm going to do is document.body, and then what we're going to do is get the client height of this. But technically, this isn't the full scrollable distance because technically, at the top of the page, we're at 0, but at the bottom of the page, we're not exactly at the bottom here. The top of the page is up here. So I need to actually remove the height of the browser itself. So what I'm going to do is also remove window.inner height, because this is scrolling from the top of the page. We want to see where the top of the page is at all points as well. Now, we're not using total distance just yet, but what we want to use it as is how far down the page should we be? Well, what I want to do is kind of work out what is this distance as a percentage of the total distance. So I'm going to do a constant percentage. Let's get the distance and divide it by the total distance, which kind of makes sense. We're taking how far we are down the page and divide it by how far the whole thing is. So now let's use this percentage in our offset to kind of animate where we are. So instead of this being distance, what I want to do is use this percentage as a distance of the path length. So I'm going to get path length in here and then multiply it by percentage. So what we're doing here is we're shifting the start of this line depending on how far down the page we are. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to go back, scroll to the top. But what we'll get now is this is kind of going the opposite way. We can see here, if we're going towards the middle, this line is going the opposite way. And that's because the way that kind of SVG paths work. All I'm going to do now is just say percentage should be 1 minus the percentage to make it go backwards. We're going to start at the bottom and go the other way. So I'm going to put some brackets around percentage and say 1 minus percentage. So percentage is just a number between 0 and 1 because we're just making it kind of divided by the both. So this is just going backwards. So by doing this, what we'll get now is that we start the page. We can see this starting to scroll down the page with us. It's doing exactly what we wanted. There we go. Now, there's a few things we could start to do in here. We could say that maybe there's a bit of an offset. So you can see here that this is starting to go off the bottom, for instance. Maybe there's certain things I want to do to kind of account for this. One thing that I like to do to just account for that is just basically do it based on the SVG height instead of the body height. To do this, I'm just going to change this document body to just SVG client height instead of it being the whole of the page, just the kind of like visible bit of the actual SVG itself. So this basically makes it a little bit easier to kind of see what is going on. So we'll see as we scroll down, this is scrolling in pretty much in view. So there we go. Another thing that we might want to do, you can see here that this isn't rounded. So we can see this kind of end bit isn't rounded. We can make that rounded very, very easily by just adding one more bit into our SVG itself. We might not want to make it pink as well. So I'm just going to go and remove the pink from this, stroke pink. We could change it back to that. We want it to be red. There we go. And the last thing I'm going to do is just make this rounded edge look rounded. So we've got this line join round. We're also going to add a stroke dash line cap equal round as well. And this will just give us this kind of rounded edge on here as well. And what we'll get by just adding these kind of few little bits in is we get this path that follows us down the page on scroll. It's not a ton of code really. Basically what we're doing in here is picking the path We find out how far down the page we are, what is the total distance we should actually cover on this, find it as a percentage, how long is the path, and then we're just basically making a dashed path that's kind of taking up the full width of the actual length of the path, and then just shifting it around depending on how far down the page that we are. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, again, of this scrolly, flowy kind of effect. If there's anything you'd like me to cover in the future, please put it down in the comments below. If you like this video or you like my new glasses, please give this video a like as always. And there should be 2 videos here for you to watch. Here we go. Bum, 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 bum.